He is not sitting on a throne. He is not standing in a temple. He is not writing from a palace library with scribes around him and lamps burning all night. He is sitting in ash. His skin is covered in sores, so painful he is scraping them with a piece of broken pottery just to feel something other than the burning. His children are dead, all 10 of them, killed in a single afternoon. His livestock are gone. His wealth is gone. His friends have come to sit with him, and for 7 days none of them said a word, because the silence of suffering is sometimes the only honest thing you can offer. This is Job. And from inside this wreckage, from inside the worst moment any human being has ever survived, he will write things about the universe that the 20th century needed billion-dollar instruments to confirm. This is not a video about patience. This is not a video about why bad things happen to good people. This is not a video about ancient poetry dressed up in scientific language. This is a video about the most precise scientific document written before the invention of the telescope, the spectrometer, the sonar, or the satellite, and about the broken man who wrote it. Before we go further, there is one creature mentioned in Job chapter 40 that I need you to hold in the back of your mind. God describes a beast called Behemoth. He says its tail sways like a cedar tree. He says its bones are tubes of bronze and its limbs like bars of iron. He says God made it alongside man as if they shared a world. No animal alive today fits that description. Zoologists have tried, theologians have argued. The hippopotamus has been proposed for centuries, and every time someone looks closely at the text, the hippo fails. Its tail is not like a cedar, it is like a rope. We will come back to Behemoth, but not yet. Because before we get to the creature, you need to understand the man. And before you understand the man, you need to understand what he was writing in the middle of, and why what he wrote should be, by every law of historical probability, completely impossible. Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible. Scholars place its composition somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years before Christ, possibly older. There is no Moses in this book, no Abraham, no covenant, no Exodus. He is a man from a land called Uz, a region scholars place in the ancient Near East, near the territory of Edom. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century after Christ, places Job among the most virtuous and wealthy men of his era, a man of standing, a man of substance. And then he lost everything in 48 hours, and he sat in the ash, and he wrote. What he wrote, sitting there, will take us the next 20 minutes to unpack. And by the time we are done, you will have to make a decision about what it means. That a man in a trash heap in the ancient Near East looked up at the night sky and described the universe with a precision that the rest of humanity would spend 35 centuries catching up to. Let's start with the most famous line. Job chapter 26 verse 7. Job is speaking, not God, not an angel, not a prophet delivering an oracle. Job himself, the man in the ash, writes this. He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. Read that again slowly. He hangs the earth on nothing. In every other cosmology of the ancient world, the earth rests on something. The Babylonians said it sat on a great ocean. The Egyptians believed it was carried on the back of a divine figure. The Greeks, the most scientifically sophisticated civilization of the ancient world, said it rested on the shoulders of Atlas. Every ancient culture, without exception, gave the earth a foundation, something underneath, something holding it up. Job said, it hangs on nothing. The Hebrew word he uses is belima, a word so rare it appears only once in all of Hebrew scripture right here, in this sentence. Belima means without anything. Isaac Newton published his law of universal gravitation in 1687. He proved that the earth is held in its orbit not by a physical support, but by the mutual gravitational attraction between masses in space, that it is, in the most literal scientific sense, hanging on nothing. The mathematics confirmed what Job had written 3,000 years earlier in a single Hebrew word. But here is what most people miss about that same verse. Job does not just say the earth hangs on nothing. He says something else first. He stretches out the north over empty space. The Hebrew word for empty space here is tohu, the same word used in Genesis 1 verse 2, where the earth was described as without form and void. Tohu means formless emptiness, a named absence. And Job does not say the south. He does not say the east or the west. He says the north. He points north, and he says there is tohu there, void, emptiness, and absence of matter stretching out in the northern sky. In 1981, astronomers mapping the northern celestial hemisphere discovered a region of space 1 billion light-years across that contains almost no galaxies, almost no matter. A supervoid, the largest known structure of emptiness in the observable universe. They found it in the north. Job named it. 3,500 years before the telescope that found it existed. A man sitting in ash pointed north and used the precise Hebrew word for void. You can call that coincidence, but I want you to sit with what that would actually require. Stay with me, because the next claim in Job goes somewhere even stranger. Job chapter 26, verse 8. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. That sentence contains a meteorological observation that most people read past without stopping. Clouds hold water, of course they do. We can see that when they rain. But Job's point is the second half. Yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. Here is the physics. A mature cumulonimbus cloud, a thunderstorm cloud, can hold up to 500,000 tons of water, 500,000 tons, suspended in the atmosphere, not falling. The reason clouds do not burst is a function of air pressure differentials, updrafts, the microscopic size of water droplets, and the thermodynamic balance between condensation and evaporation. It is a precise and complex atmospheric system that meteorologists spent centuries working out. Job described the phenomenon in one sentence, almost as an aside. And then there is Job's youngest companion, Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, a young man so angry at everyone in this book that he spent 6 chapters interrupting before God showed up. But here is the remarkable thing about Elihu. In Job chapters 36 and 37, before God speaks from the whirlwind, Elihu delivers a speech that reads like a meteorology lecture. He describes how God loads clouds with moisture, how lightning discharges, how wind comes from its chambers, how frost forms. The technical vocabulary in Elihu's speech is so specific that modern atmospheric scientists have noted its accuracy. And then God arrives, and essentially continues Elihu's meteorology course with 64 questions that nobody in 1500 BC could answer. But the one that should stop you completely is Job chapter 38, verse 16. God is speaking now from the whirlwind. He asks Job directly, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Or have you walked in the recesses of the deep?" The springs of the sea. For most of human history, that phrase made no scientific sense. The sea has no springs. Springs are a land feature, underground water pushing up through rock. The ocean floor was presumed to be flat, featureless, cold, and dead. That was the consensus in marine science well into the 20th century. In February of 1977, a team of oceanographers aboard the research vessel Knorr lowered instruments into the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Rift, approximately 8,000 feet below the surface. What they found shattered the consensus. Hydrothermal vents, cracks in the ocean floor pouring superheated water loaded with minerals up from the Earth's mantle into the sea. Springs in the sea. Robert Ballard, who would later discover the Titanic, described the discovery as finding another world. Entire ecosystems living in total darkness, powered not by sunlight but by the heat of the earth below. God asked Job about the springs of the sea in 1500 BC. The springs were confirmed in 1977. The gap is 3,500 years, and in that entire gap, no scientist, no explorer, no philosopher guessed correctly, except the voice in the whirlwind. Here is what we have seen so far. Job said the earth hangs on nothing. Newton confirmed it in 1687. Job described a void in the northern sky. Astronomers confirmed it in 1981. Job's God asked about springs in the sea. Oceanographers found them in 1977. 3 separate scientific claims, 3 separate centuries of confirmation, every single one pointing in the same direction. If this is landing with the weight I think it is, take a second right now and subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that genuinely keeps scientists up at night. We have not touched the stars yet. We have not touched the lightning. We have not touched the snow. And we have not gotten to Behemoth, the creature with the cedar tree tail, the the creature God says he made alongside man. That is coming. And when it does, you will understand why this book has been argued about for 3,000 years and still has not been fully explained. God's speech in Job chapters 38 through 41 is unlike anything else in Scripture. It is not comfort. It is not reassurance. God shows up in a whirlwind, not a still small voice, not a burning bush, not an angel with a gentle greeting. A whirlwind. And he asks Job 64 questions in a row. Not one of them has an answer. Every single one is a scientific impossibility for a man in 1500 BC. Here is what most people miss when they read those chapters. The questions are not random. They are organized. God moves systematically through the major disciplines of what we now call natural science. He starts with cosmology. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? He moves to geology. What holds the earth's cornerstone in place? He moves to oceanography. Where does the sea begin? He moves to meteorology. Where does light come from? Where does darkness live? He moves to astronomy. And here is where the questions become extraordinary. Job chapter 38, verses 31 and 32. God asks, "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season?" The Pleiades is a star cluster in the constellation Taurus, a group of stars that appear to move together across the sky, bound as if connected. What God is asking Job is whether he can bind the gravitational forces that hold that cluster together, or release them. The Hebrew word translated chains here is kima, which ancient astronomers associated with the Pleiades cluster. Modern astrophysics has confirmed that the Pleiades is a gravitationally bound open cluster. The stars are held together by mutual gravitational attraction. They are chained, in the most literal physical sense. And the belt of Orion, the three stars Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, are not gravitationally bound. They only appear aligned from our perspective on Earth. They are drifting apart. They are, in the most literal physical sense, loose. God asked Job whether he could bind what is gravitationally bound or loose what is gravitationally unbound. In 1500 BC, the distinction between gravitationally bound and unbound star systems would not be understood by human astronomers until the 19th and 20th centuries. Job's God made the distinction in a single sentence. Pay attention to this next one. Job chapter 38, verse 35. God asks, "Can you send lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, saying, 'Here we are'?" Read that last phrase again. Do they report to you? Lightning or light itself, going out and then reporting back. The image God uses is of a messenger sent out who then returns with a report. James Clerk Maxwell published his theory of electromagnetic radiation in 1865. He proved that light, radio waves, and electricity are all forms of the same electromagnetic phenomenon, that they travel outward from their source, and in the case of radar and radio, can indeed be sent out and then received back as a signal. The concept of light as a wave that travels outward and returns information became the foundation of radar, sonar, radio astronomy, and ultimately of every communication technology you use today. God asked Job about it, 33 centuries before Maxwell. And then there is the snow. Job chapter 38, verse 22. God asks, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail?" The word storehouses implies structure, design, hidden architecture. For most of human history, snow was just frozen water, precipitation. There was nothing particularly architectural about it. In 1611, Johannes Kepler published a small monograph called On the Six-Cornered Snowflake, the first scientific paper arguing that snowflakes have a consistent geometric structure based on a six-sided pattern. He was right. Every snowflake forms around a hexagonal ice crystal lattice, a structure so precise and so consistent that it appears throughout the natural world in materials, science, crystallography, and molecular chemistry. The storehouse of the snow has architecture. It was designed. God asked Job if he had seen it. In 1500 BC, the answer was no. By this point in God's speech, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, the three friends who spent 35 chapters telling Job exactly why God was angry at him and exactly what Job needed to do to fix it, have gone very quiet. These three men represented the religious establishment of their age. They had answers, they had systems, they had theology. And then God showed up and started asking questions about electromagnetic radiation and gravitational star clusters, and none of them said another word. Here is the part nobody tells you. At the end of God's speech, he turns to Eliphaz and says, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Job, the man in the ash, the man who questioned, who argued, who cried out, spoke rightly about God. The men with the theological systems and the confident answers did not. And now, Behemoth. Job chapter 40, verse 15. God is still speaking. He has just finished 64 questions about the cosmos, the ocean floor, the atmosphere, and the stars. And now he points Job toward a creature. "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. See the strength in his hips, the power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron." For centuries, the most common interpretation of Behemoth has been the hippopotamus. The hippo is large. It lives near the Nile. It is powerful. It is the biggest land animal in the ancient Near East that a person in 1500 BC would have encountered. The problem is the tail. A hippopotamus has a tail approximately 8 to 12 inches long. It is thin and bristled. No one who has ever looked at a hippopotamus tail has described it as swaying like a cedar. A cedar tree, a Lebanon cedar, grows to heights of 40 meters with a trunk base that can exceed 2.5 meters in diameter. If you are describing an animal whose tail sways like a cedar tree, you are describing something with a tail that is large, thick, muscular, and massive. There is one category of animal whose tail fits that description. Sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked, long-tailed quadrupeds like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, had tails that could stretch to lengths of 12 to 15 meters, thick at the base, tapering toward the tip, swaying like a great tree when they walked. The largest sauropods had bones that were, in the most literal physical sense, tubes of bronze, hollow yet extraordinarily strong, engineered by their density and structure to support body weights of up to 80 tons. The standard objection is simple and seems obvious. Dinosaurs were extinct 65 million years before any human being walked the earth. If that timeline is correct, Job could not have seen a sauropod. But here is what God says in the text, and this is the part that has never been adequately answered by those who dismiss the connection. God says, "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you." Along with you. God places the creation of Behemoth in the same creative event as the creation of man. He is not describing a fossil. He is describing something Job would recognize from the world he inhabited. The question of whether humans and large dinosaur-like creatures coexisted in the ancient Near East is not one this video will resolve. What is undeniable is that the description in Job 40 is the most accurate anatomical description of a sauropod that exists in any ancient document, and it was written 3,500 years before paleontology gave us a name for what a sauropod was. Johannes Kepler, who in 1619 published his laws of planetary motion, the mathematical foundation of modern astronomy, wrote in Harmonices Mundi that in discovering those laws he felt he was thinking God's thoughts after him. That phrase has stayed with scientists for 400 years. When you read Job chapters 38 through 41 and then lay the questions God asked beside the discoveries of Newton, Maxwell, Ballard, Kepler, and the astronomers who found the supervoid, you feel what Kepler felt. The questions were already there. The answers took 3,000 years. And here is the thing that should end you completely if you let it. Job never got an explanation. He asked for one, he demanded one. He argued his case with God for 35 chapters. And when God finally showed up, in a whirlwind, which is not the arrival of a God who is apologizing, God did not explain why Job's children died. He did not explain why the suffering happened. He did not give Job the theological answer that Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar had been confidently providing for weeks. He asked Job 64 questions about the cosmos that Job could not answer. And Job said this, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." That is it. No explanation received, no injustice addressed, no children returned. Not yet, not in that moment. Just the presence of God. Just the whirlwind, just the voice that knew about the springs of the sea and the chains of the Pleiades and the architecture of snowflakes and the creature with the cedar tree tail. And it was enough. Job said it was enough. The man who knew the most about the universe, the man who somehow, sitting in ash, had written things that 3,000 years of science would confirm, said that hearing the voice was sufficient, not the answers, the voice. Here are 3 things I want you to carry out of this video. The first is this: Job is not a book about suffering. It is the most scientifically precise document produced in the ancient world, written by a man who had every reason to stop thinking about the universe, and every reason to think only about his own pain. Instead, he looked up, and what he wrote while looking up has been confirmed, discovery by discovery, for 3.5 millennia. The earth hanging on nothing, the void in the north, the springs of the sea, the chains of the Pleiades, the architecture of snow, confirmed, everyone. The second is for you personally. The 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, were not evil men. They were religious men. They had systems. They had answers. They arrived at the ash heap with their theology intact, and they applied it with confidence, and they were wrong. Job, who had no system left, who had only questions and grief, and the audacity to bring both directly to God, was told by God that he had spoken rightly. There is something in that for every person who has sat in their own version of the ash heap and felt like their questions disqualified them. Job's questions were not a barrier to God. They were the conversation. And the third: Job never got the explanation he asked for. The children who died in chapter 1 are not explained in chapter 42. The whirlwind did not come with a theology of suffering. It came with a presence. And Job, the man who had debated God across 35 chapters, the man who had demanded to present his case, fell silent, not because he was defeated, because he saw something that made the explanation unnecessary. The God who made Behemoth and hung the earth on Belima and scattered the Pleiades and opened springs in the floor of the ocean showed up in the whirlwind. And Job said, "Now my eyes have seen you," and that was enough. Which of the scientific discoveries in Job hit you the hardest? Was it the northern void, the springs of the sea, the chains of the Pleiades, or Behemoth, the creature that still has no satisfying explanation? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this changed the way you see Job, share it with one person who thinks the Bible has nothing left to teach us. Because the man in the ash heap was 35 centuries ahead of us, and we are still catching up.